In this video about organelles, I'm going to talk about organelles that are associated with storage, cleaning, and support within cells. The first one I'm going to talk about is associated with storage. These are going to be vacuoles. There are different types of vacuoles. There's a large central vacuole that exists usually in plant cells. So this is a plant cell, and as you can see, this massive sort of open area is this vacuole. It's larger than the nucleus. It's pushing everything else to the side, interestingly. In plants, this will really be associated with holding water. However, animal cells can have vacuoles. They're usually going to have sort of multiple small vacuoles, and they also exist more primarily than in our cells, but more in sort of unicellular animal cells. But vacuoles are basically, in general, storage containers for water, food, enzymes, waste, pigments, anything that the cell needs to hold, it'll put into a vacuole. Vesicles are going to be similar to vacuoles, except for not only are they associated with storage, but they're also associated with moving materials between organelles and between organelles and the cell surface. So, for example, if the cell needed to excrete something into its environment, it would use a vesicle. So here we see little vesicles moving items from one organelle to another. You can sort of think of these as sort of like trucks or even like pods, the idea of like not only storing things but also moving it when you want to move it. And here you also see vesicles moving items from organelles to the cell surface or bringing in items into the cell. Okay, so the big difference between vesicles and vacuoles is that we'll usually talk about vesicles and associated with movement around the cell. Associated with cleanup are going to be lysosomes, and here you should hear this word lys, which means to break. So lysosomes mean to break. And so lysosomes will be sort of a garbage disposal of the cell, will contain digestive enzymes that will break down wastes. So lysosome is where things will go to break down. It'll also break down old and broken organelles, anything that the cell no longer needs, no longer wants around, sort of it's been used and is done, doesn't want it to do its job anymore, or if it's broken. And therefore sort of is not helping the cell will have it broken down and send it to the lysosome. A lysosome is sometimes referred to as a suicide packet or a suicide organelle, and that's because if a cell wants to commit suicide, which by the way is called apoptosis, which is one of my favorite words. It's just super fun to say, apoptosis. If a cell wants to commit suicide or do apoptosis, it will burst open its lysosome, and all of those digestive enzymes will be free to go around the cell and just digest everything. The cytoskeleton, we can think about the words that we hear there. Cyto referring to the cell, and just like we heard in cytoplasm, sort of the cell, sort of gelatin, and then skeleton, this is literally a cell's skeleton. It will act as the skeleton and the muscle of a cell. It'll provide its shape and structure, and it will also help organelles move around. They'll sort of act like roadways within the cell. Now there's multiple different types of cytoskeleton that we will not be discussing for this class. But one thing you should know is that cytoskeleton is not a membrane-bound organelle. In fact, some people would not consider the cytoskeleton to be an organelle, but you should know that the cytoskeleton exists in prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So, all cells have cytoskeleton. We're going to talk about a couple specific things associated with cytoskeleton. Cytoskeleton creates things called centrioles. These we're not going to talk about that much until we get to cell division, but they are located near the nucleus. They do help organize cell division, and you should know, you do need to know, that this is an example of an organelle that only exists in animals. Later we're going to talk about a couple that only exist in plants. We already talked about that large central vacuole, but this is a sort of unique one that only exists in animals. And the other thing that cytoskeleton does, not centrioles, but cytoskeleton helps build cilia and flagella, which also occur only in animals if we compare animals and plants, but these also will, of course, occur in prokaryotes as well. Cilia and flagella are both associated with movement of cells, and here we've sort of pictured some single-celled organisms or unicellular organisms, single-celled or one cell. Cilia are going to be these small hair-like projections on cells that are associated with movement. You can imagine them all sort of beating at the same time, associated with each other. This particular organism also has cilia that surround a mouth pore, and so those will try to guide food particles into its orifice. And flagella, on the other hand, are sort of these long whip-like tails that aid in movement. They can be on the end, sort of as you would imagine as a tail, or in fact, some organisms have them sort of on the front end and they move in the direction of the flagella, which is sort of interesting. We actually see both cilia and flagella in humans in various places. There are cilia that line your esophagus that help move mucus around, as well as cilia that exist in a woman's fallopian tubes. Flagella, the big example of flagella in humans is sort of the tail that exists on sperm cells. So even though we usually talk about them in terms of single-celled organisms, they do exist in humans.